The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 12. The Priest of St. Mary. Although I could barely walk any further, my brave mule pulled me unwaveringly towards the city. I felt like I was in a trance, following his footsteps, always putting one foot in front of the other without thinking about the entire distance. I hardly noticed the cold that penetrated my body from all sides. We broke through the regiments of the swirling snowflakes. It was like wandering through a tunnel. And finally I was able to see the spire of the Church of St. Mary, which stood out behind some trees. "There, Harry," I shouted, directing his steps with a slight turn to the right. Soon we reached the outskirts of the city, and immediately afterwards the church building. By gently pulling on the leash, I brought the mule to a standstill. He neighed, and I took a step forward to his head and petted him. "We actually made it," I said. "You're an excellent companion, Harry. Maybe you should move into Baker Street instead of Holmes." I laughed at my own joke because no one else was there to do it. My mood was euphoric when I approached the church door and knocked on the metal ring 3 times. Immediately I heard steps inside and the gate was opened. An old Anglican priest with grey hair and small round glasses stood in front of me, studying my face closely. Then he briefly looked to the sky, from which masses of snowflakes were still falling, and said, "Your search for a warm place is over, my son. Please, just step in." I did as requested and was glad to finally be back inside a building, protected from the storm outside. The priest then noticed my monk's sledge and expertly stated, "Oh, you are Franciscan. Well, in this case, welcome in the spirit of ecumenical fraternity." Of course, I should have set this error right immediately, but for the time being all that came across my lips was a quiet, "Thank you." "It is quite all right," replied the priest, pulling on my sleeve, leading me across the small nave into the private adjoining rooms. It was only in the kitchen where he invited me to sit down at a small table and let go of me. "You have to be completely frozen," he said. "Come, take a sip. It will warm you." To my surprise, however, he did not give me a cup of tea as I expected, but put a glass and a bottle of brandy in front of me. "Help yourself," he said. "I am going to take your mule to the stables for the time being and feed it." And then the old man disappeared for a few minutes. Meanwhile, I was warming myself at the oven fire and emptied 2 small glasses of brandy. When the priest returned, he asked, "Are you on your way to the abbey in Twickenham? You should refrain from doing so at the moment. This year we have an exceptionally early and energetic winter break, with astonishing amounts of snow and low temperatures. One might almost think that an ice age is coming. The railway is not running, the roads are closed, and no one can walk across the hills at Strawberry Hill at the moment. You would be in deadly danger." "You are right, Father," I muttered, taking another sip of the brandy. "Well, since you are not a member of my church," the priest declared, "please just call me Reverend Thomas Blake. And you are—" I stuttered, since I was still very cold. My name is John." "Brother John," the priest immediately interrupted me. "What a wonderful religious name, based on John the Baptist or the Evangelist." It was time to clear up this whole misunderstanding. "Actually, I'm not a Franciscan at all," I replied. "I was given this warming cowl and the mule from the friars at the Redeemer's Abbey, from where I left this morning. Both helped me greatly to make it here." The Reverend was surprised. "You walked from Twickenham to Teddington today?" he asked incredulously. "It is a miracle that you survived. You must have a very important reason to come to our city." "I do," I immediately confirmed. "I am involved in a police investigation at the Abbey. To sum it all up, there were 2 murder victims and a fire." A murder in the convent? The Reverend said, irritated. That's awful, Inspector. Actually, I am not an inspector, I corrected again. My full name is Dr. John Watson. I am a physician from London. Reverend Blake smiled. Friar, policeman, or doctor, he said, you should decide on one thing, Mr. Watson. I think I'll decide on being a doctor, I replied. I promise I am supporting Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard and the famous detective Sherlock Holmes in investigating the murders at the Abbey. Holmes? The priest repeated, shrugging his shoulders indifferently. Never heard of him. I was inclined to laugh in amusement, but held back and had another sip of brandy instead. I don't understand it, though, continued Reverend Blake. What's so urgent that you have to come all the way to Teddington in a blizzard? What do you hope to find here? How can we help you solve the case? It's all about the victim, I said. We have reason to believe that he was originally from this town. That is why I'm here, Father. For who would know better about the people living in his town than the local priest? Absolutely right, replied the old man. I keep an accurate baptism, marriage, and death register. If it is indeed a member of the Anglican community of our village, your victim is recorded in it. But don't take it the wrong way if I do really hope that you are wrong. Could I see this register? I asked. But Reverend Blake shook his head with a laugh and then tapped his temples. That's not going to be necessary, Dr. Watson, he replied. It's all in here. Just tell me what the name of the unfortunate is. It's about Simon Taylor, I proclaimed. Suddenly the priest lost his carefreeness. For heaven's sake, he stuttered. That's terrible. So you knew Mr. Taylor? I guessed. Oh, yes, said Reverend Blake. I baptized Simon myself, next door in front of the altar. It seems to me like yesterday. I saw him grow up, taught him, and supported him in difficult times. We're not a very large community. What were the difficult times that you mentioned? I asked. His family never had it easy, the priest said. Simon's father settled in America when the boy was just 1.5 years old. There were no other relatives. The mother remained alone and had to feed the family. You can imagine how difficult it was. And when Simon was 16, his mother died unexpectedly, after a short illness. He had nothing but a small house, a vegetable garden, and a few sheep. I remembered the portrait of a woman from Simon's or Brother Emanuel's Bible. Holmes had given it to me, and now I pulled it out to show it to the Reverend. Is that maybe Simon's mother? I asked. The priest took the picture and looked at it. There is a natural resemblance, he noted, but no, that's not the mother. This is Maria Taylor, Simon's younger sister. I was surprised because we had completely ignored this possibility so far. He had a sister? I asked. Yes, the Reverend Blake confirmed. She was born about 3 years after Simon. Mrs. Taylor claimed no father at the time, but of course this is complete nonsense. If you say so, Father, I replied abruptly, but the priest ignored that illusion. It didn't make the family's situation any easier, he continued. When the mother died, the 2 young siblings had a rough time, and I supported them in every way I could. When Simon turned 18, he decided to temporarily look for better employment than a shepherd. He wanted to hire on a merchant ship, but the British captains did not hire him since he had no recommendations, and so he landed on a German ship from Lubeck, which just happened to be moored in Southampton. For 2 years he sailed the trade routes of the North and Baltic Seas, saving all his money to return to Teddington with the money so his sister could have a better life. I suppose, I said, this is where it gets bad. The Reverend nodded approvingly. In fact, he said, Simon had to leave his sister here in the meantime. She was supposed to take care of the sheep, which would guarantee her a half-tolerable life. For a while it went well. Every now and then I visited her to look after her. But one day Maria was gone and did not come back. I noticed that the sheep were dead, but her disappearance was, and still is, a mystery to me. And then Simon came back? I said. Yes, the Reverend continued. At first he was deeply saddened by his sister's disappearance. I was afraid he would do something stupid, but then he sat down and decided to look for her. He was convinced that she was alive and needed his help. When he told me about his plans, it was the last time I saw him. That must have been about half a year ago. I don't know any more. It's a sad thing, and now he is supposed to be dead. The final chord of a fatal family history strung. The ways of the Lord are truly fathomless. To be honest, I replied, the story has become even stranger. After leaving Teddington again, he apparently converted to Catholicism, and even more so, he joined the Redeemer's Abbey in Twickenham as a novice. And there he was killed. That is very strange, Reverend Blake said. Simon has always been a committed and faithful member of our Anglican community. It is more than surprising that he transitions to another church and decides to live as a friar. But no one knows. Perhaps only this gave him the necessary support to deal with all the terrible losses, the tragedies of his life and his family. The good man might have been right. Perhaps the culminating misfortune of his family history was Simon's motivation to enter the monastery. Who, if not God, could give an answer to his grief and bitterness? On the other hand, for many people, these undeserved blows of fate would have been a reason to turn away from God. Perhaps this was the reason for the conversion from the Anglican to the Catholic Church. I have to admit, I still couldn't put any sense into this. Nevertheless, I had received all the expected information and more. Our presumption of a longer service on a German merchant ship had been confirmed. In addition, the identity of the young lady whose portrait Brother Emanuel had hidden in his Bible had also been clarified. In addition, the family history also allowed some conclusions to be drawn about the character of our first murder victim. But I could not deduct a possible motive for killing him out of all I heard. And without that, we still had no more concrete clue to track down the perpetrator. So I had to ask myself a question with a difficult answer. What would Holmes do in my place?